1904, Europe. Photos from the Congo begin to emerge in local newspapers. They are difficult to look at. Europe is immersed in shock. In one image, a man, a father, sits silently, staring into the camera. At his feet, the severed hand and foot of his daughter. These horrific photos spread quickly throughout Europe. And with them, the stories. Whole villages burned to the ground, entire Congolese families taken hostage, women and children left to starve. At first, it is unbelievable for Europe. The reports seem too horrific, too impossible. Who could be capable of such evil? But the horrifying reports and evidence keep emerging. Witnesses, missionaries, investigators all tell the same stories of horror committed in broad daylight. And at the center of it all stood one man, an unlikely figure, not an empire, not a government, a European king. An African territory larger than much of Western Europe turned into his personal estate to control, exploit, and abuse in the guise of humanitarian causes. But how had the situation deteriorated to this extent? How had one European king blinded the world and managed to acquire and own an entire country as his personal property? What system had been created inside that vast territory that could produce such suffering on such a large scale? What did this terror do to the people who lived through it? And what kind of scars were left behind that stretched on into the future of a nation? In the late 19th century, Europe was a continent of empires. Its most powerful nations stretched their influence across continents, accumulating wealth, prestige, and global dominance. Britain commanded vast territories across the world. France had expanded steadily into Africa and Asia. And even older empires like Portugal still held and commanded distant lands far from Europe. It was the height of European imperial expansion. But Belgium stood apart. It was small, young, and largely overlooked in the race for global power. And for its king, Leopold II, this was not just a limitation, it was an insult. Leopold was frustrated. And for years, he had watched other European rulers conquer and build empires that elevated their nations and secured their place in history, while Belgium remained the same, small, overlooked, and without any overseas territories and no global influence to match its rivals. Leopold could not stand this humiliation. He wanted more. He wanted all his European rivals had, and not just influence for Belgium, but power, prestige, and recognition for himself as well. He had come to believe that without a colony, Belgium, and more importantly, its king, him, would remain insignificant on the world stage. And if his country would not act, he would find another way. So, in 1876, Leopold made a decisive move. He convened a grand geographical conference in Brussels, bringing together explorers, scientists, and influential figures from across Europe. And to the outside world, the gathering was noble in purpose, a meeting dedicated to advance science, exploration, and humanitarian work in Africa. And when the conference was done, out of it emerged the International African Association, an organization built on the promise to bring Christianity, education, and progress to Central Africa. But this language of civilization and humanitarianism was rather Leopold's cover of his real master plan and personal ambition. It was a justification for entry into Africa. And then, just when Leopold had formed his organization and was looking for the next move, a year later, in 1877, an opportunity presented itself. An explorer emerged from the heart of Africa, returning to Europe with the news that would reshape European understanding of the continent. The explorer was Henry Morton Stanley. After years of travel, he had crossed Central Africa, tracing the course of the Great Congo River and revealing a region that was vast, connected, and largely unknown to European powers. Henry Morton Stanley's reports spoke of an immense basin bound together by a powerful river system that stretched deep into the interior, opening access to lands that had long remained beyond the reach of Europe. To Europe, it was a remarkable discovery that made Africa's deep interior sound accessible and reachable. But to Leopold, it was more an opening, a chance to gain entry into a territory vast enough to rival empires, a region rich enough and fit enough for his ambitions to take root. He could not, and he did not, hesitate. In 1879, Leopold brought Stanley into his service and sent him back into the Congo, this time not as an explorer, but as his personal representative. Along the great river Congo and across the surrounding lands, Henry Morton Stanley established stations for Leopold, moving from one community to another, meeting local chiefs and leaders. He signed hundreds of agreements with them on behalf of Leopold. To the Congolese local chiefs, these agreements with Henry Morton Stanley on behalf of King Leopold II were treaties of friendship, trade, and cooperation, arrangements that promised protection and partnership. But to Leopold, they meant something entirely different. He was gaining control, ownership, and legitimacy over the Congo basin. And so, through ink and paper, vast territories were obtained through misrepresentation. And by the early 1880s, the Congo was no longer just a distant African region described in reports. Leopold was on the verge of having it as his personal possession. But ambition, deceit, and misrepresentation alone were not going to be enough. Leopold needed recognition. He needed legitimacy, and in Europe, from other European empires, and his timing was not off. A moment was approaching that would give him exactly that recognition. In the early 1880s, as Leopold was closing in on the Congo, the scramble for Africa among European powers had also just begun to intensify. And with it came a growing fear that rival nations may turn on each other in conflict over African territories. It was a fear that threatened to spill back into Europe itself. So, in 1884, a conference was convened in Berlin to bring order to the scramble, to establish rules, and to prevent war among Europe's empires. And Leopold saw it as the exact opportunity he had been waiting for. Thus, while European dignitaries debated principles and procedures in the Berlin conference halls, Leopold schemed and plotted, and he presented his case and plans for the Congo basin and its people. He spoke not of conquest, but of humanitarian work, bringing civilization, Christianity, and progress to Central Africa. The European dignitaries heard and were impressed by Leopold and his humanitarian plans. they agreed to recognize his claims over the Congo, granting him exclusive control over the basin. Leopold's schemes had paid off and got him what he had wanted: recognition and legitimacy. And unlike other colonies, the Congo was not declared a Belgian colony. It was given to him, Leopold, in his personal capacity as his own personal property to manage and control using his kingship. And so what had begun as a carefully constructed plan was now real: an African territory larger than much of Western Europe, a personal possession of one man. And in 1885, having secured European recognition, Leopold formally declared the creation of the Congo Free State, placing it under his personal rule and dominion. And now he had to consolidate his rule over his new territory, a process that would unfold between 1885 and 1890, as control was imposed across the Congo. Across the vast territory, Leopold built his system of control, establishing a colonial administration, creating military posts, and forming the Force Publique, a military force made up of European officers and African soldiers, tasked with enforcing his rule over the basin. In doing so, his stations spread across and along the Congo River and deeper into the interior. And over these years, from 1885 to 1890, his control steadily tightened across the Congo. But control and possession were not enough, and were not going to be enough. Leopold longed for more, for wealth. And as the 1890s dawned, an opportunity would arise. In the 1890s, across Europe and beyond, demand for rubber surged as industries expanded and new technologies emerged, from bicycles to machinery to electrical systems, all requiring rubber. The demand was endless, and lucrative was promised to those that would provide constant supply. And in Leopold's Congo, rubber was abundant in its vast wild forests, and all of a sudden his possession was far more valuable and a potential source of immense profit. And what he had desired most had arrived: wealth. As Leopold and his administration quickly recognized what immense profit and wealth the demand for rubber meant, the system that had so far been in place in Congo had to be reshaped and refined in order to extract that wealth. Thus, across the territory, his administration was reorganized around collection and extraction of rubber from the vast tropical forests of the Congo to be exported to European markets. So through his administration, Leopold put in place posts, agents, and overseers across the Congo, solely with the objective of gathering as much rubber as they could from the dense forests. But there was a problem that Leopold and his administration quickly encountered. The Congo was too vast, wild, and remote, and European manpower alone was limited. It was not going to be enough for his rubber extraction plans. So to meet the growing demand, the burden would have to fall elsewhere. And Leopold and his administration devised a scheme so evil and terrorizing that would lead to such untold suffering of the Congolese people. The scheme was arranged from the early 1890s to 1905, and it would involve the locals, using them as a source of cheap labor. And what followed was not a simple system of work, but a carefully constructed machinery of extraction and control that reached into every corner of life in the Congo. Across villages, quotas were imposed, often on a monthly basis, demanding fixed amounts of rubber that bore little relation to what could realistically be gathered from the forests. Men had to be forced to leave their homes for days and sometimes weeks at a time, sent deep into the dense forest to harvest wild rubber, with their survival now tied to meeting targets set by Leopold and his administrators. To enforce these demands, the Force Publique was deployed as an instrument to instill pressure and fear in the Congolese locals. The Force Publique soldiers were stationed near villages to monitor output and ensure compliance, and were to intervene with force onto households when quotas were not met. With this scheme in place, the economic system of the people of the Congo was fundamentally altered. Families and homesteads were forced to abandon farming, the very activity that sustained their households. As men were driven into the forest to meet rubber quotas, it meant that fields were left unattended to, harvests could not be carried out, and then food production began to decline across the entire regions of the Congo Basin. And with the decline in food production, with men, the breadwinners, absent from their families for long periods to carry out farming, famine resulted. This famine would lead to such untold starvation of women and children, where Leopold and his administrators watched. To them, nothing mattered more than those rubber quotas. With this starvation came death on a growing scale that slowly and surely would consume entire Congolese communities. But this was just the beginning. By the mid-1890s, as rubber demands intensified, what had begun as forced labor evolved into something far more brutal and deliberate, a system of coercion designed not to extract but to enforce compliance at any cost across the Congo for Leopold's profits and gain. At the peak of starvation and deprivation, men were no longer simply forced to work. They were driven into the forests under threat and were not allowed to return to their villages without meeting their quotas. Days would turn into weeks, and weeks into longer stretches of absence, as they were made to remain deep within the forests, gathering rubber under constant fear, beatings, and the threat of more immediate brutal punishments. In those forests, there was little provision of food, and in many cases, none at all. These Congolese men had to survive on whatever they could find, often inadequate and insufficient. As a result, hunger set in, their bodies started to weaken, and yet were still required to continue working, with a real possibility of death in those forests. And still, that was not enough. The schemers employed by Leopold to guarantee total compliance, wives, children, and relatives were in several cases seized and held hostage, or confined in stations, or put under guard with their self-return dependent on their men, their families meeting monthly quotas. This meant that missed targets placed loved ones at immediate risk. Across communities, the presence of Force Publique ensured that rubber extraction scheme was well enforced. These Force Publique soldiers would move from village to village, enforcing quotas, carrying out punishments, and making examples of those who failed. For those failing to meet their monthly quotas, beatings were administered, often in front of loved ones. Homes would be burned. All brutal methods designed to instill fear and obedience across regions. And as if those punishments were not enough, as the system hardened, mutilations were introduced to further compel Congolese masses to work harder and meet their monthly quotas. These mutilations became one of its most disturbing brutal practices of ensuring unrealistic rubber quotas were being met. Force Publique soldiers were required to account for the ammunition used to execute rubber quota defaulters, and in doing so, they would sever hands and other bodily parts to go back with to Leopold's administrators as proof that bullets had been used to kill the robber defaulters. This turned into widespread acts of violence where individuals, families, and even children and women became victims of the brutal robber collecting system. And in the period between the early 1890s to 1905, the impacts of the brutal scheme were so severe and so widespread across the entire Congo region. Leopold's Congo Free State was not for the free at all. Men vanished into the forests for weeks and months, returning weakened or not at all. Households thinned, women and children went hungry. Disease and starvation became the norm of the Congolese. And the rhythms of village life broke apart, fear settling into the daily lives of Congolese. Movement itself became very dangerous for the Congolese, as Force Publique patrols were constantly surveying the land. In region after region across the Congo basin, the strain deepened into chaos, and in some places, entire villages as a result vanished, leaving empty stretches of land once homes. By 1905, the consequences of Leopold's system had become so severe and so widespread that they could no longer be contained within the dense forests and villages of the Congo. The suffering that had for years remained hidden deep within the interior began to slowly and quietly creep out the world's horror. But it would take numerous witnesses and efforts for the world to come to grips with the suffering Leopold and his scheme had brought onto the people of the Congo. It were the missionaries in the 1890s that first witnessed the scheme and its horrors on the people of the Congo. These missionaries were living and working within the Congo. Doing their work moving from village to village, the missionaries started to notice villages being weakened and communities slowly crumbling. These missionaries started to ask and speak to families that had been broken to find out what was leading to the collapse of communities. It is then that they heard the stories of brutality committed against them by Leopold and his administration. And soon, through their work, they started to encounter Leopold's system at work. They noticed how it systematically brought untold suffering upon the Congolese and were horrified. How could they remain quiet? Without the communities to preach to, their very missionary work was under threat. So they began to write. Their letters described what had been seen and were continuing to preserve, narrated accounts of forced labor, starvation, and violence. These missionary letters were sent out to all their networks across Europe and North America. And soon, their letters were followed by photographs taken by missionaries themselves, capturing moments that words alone could not fully convey. Together, these reports began to form a picture that was difficult to miss. But even then, the international response was low and uncertain. The claims by missionaries seemed extreme, and for many Europeans, they challenged the carefully constructed image Leopold had presented to the world. However, given the missionary reports, in the late 1890s, traders and shipping agents working the routes between the Congo and Europe began to notice something deeply unusual. Ships arriving in Europe from the Congo arrived loaded with vast quantities of rubber and ivory. Yet these ships were returning to the Congo without any goods that would normally balance such trade. Instead of tools, textiles, or goods of exchange for the rubber and ivory delivered, these ships will return carrying only weapons, ammunition, and administrative supplies. This imbalance revealed that wealth leaving the Congo was not being traded for, but being taken. pointing to a system driven not by commerce, but by coercion and apprehension. Among those who took notice was a young shipping clerk in Liverpool named Edmund Dene Morel. Day after day, Morel would handle cargo manifests and port records, and what he observed about the Congo ships did not make sense. To him, a territory exporting immense wealth, yet importing almost nothing of value in return, could not be operating on free trade. To Morel, that could only be a system sustained by coercion. So Morel began to write and speak about what he had uncovered, connecting the flow of rubber to the reports coming from missionaries and travelers. And in doing so, he transformed scattered concerns into a pattern that could be understood and challenged. As Morel's findings spread wide and began to align with the growing body of missionary reports, the issue could no longer be dismissed as isolated or exaggerated. What had been distant accounts was now supported by evidence that seemed to point to a structured system of extraction and coercion. And this began to draw attention of European governments, particularly in Britain, where trade interests, humanitarian concerns, and public pressure were beginning to converge. So in 1903, the reports of extraction and brutality in the Congo by Leopold and his administration could no longer be ignored. The British government, facing mounting pressure and growing scrutiny from the public, dispatched Roger Casement, a British consul and experienced diplomat, to investigate the situation in the Congo, making the first official inquiry into Leopold's administration. Casement in the Congo traveled through affected regions, speaking directly to Congolese men and women, listening to their accounts and documenting their experiences. He gathered testimonies, story after story, from the Congolese that had been brutalized by the system, confirming what missionaries had been reporting for years. When his findings were compiled and presented in 1904, they exposed a pattern of exploitation and violence that was so perverse and brutal against the Congolese that could no longer be dismissed as exaggeration or an isolated incident. That same year, 1904, the momentum that had been building against Leopold and his scheme of extraction and brutality in the Congo now took on a new and far more organized form. Edmund Dene Morel, who had first come to question the Congo system through his work in shipping, had since emerged as a journalist and outspoken critic, now moved beyond writing and exposure. With his findings confirmed and strengthened by Casement's report, he founded the Congo Reform Association in 1904, transforming what had been scattered reports and growing concern into a coordinated international campaign against Leopold and his administration in the Congo. This became a collective demand for accountability. The campaign drew in writers, politicians, missionaries, and activists, amplifying the evidence that had already been circulating. Meetings were held, publications increased, and pressure began to build. And not just among the public, but within European governments themselves. Between 1904 and 1908, the story of the Congo spread widely. Newspapers across Europe and North America carried reports of what had been uncovered, and the photographs that had once circulated quietly now reached a broader audience. Leopold's image began to unravel. The humanitarian narrative he had carefully constructed could no longer hold, and under growing scrutiny, his administration faced increasing pressure from both the public and foreign governments. And so, by the late 1900s, the pressure that had been building against Leopold and his rule over the Congo had reached a breaking point. The reports, the testimonies, the photographs, and the growing international outrage began to close in on him, and the system he had built could no longer be shielded behind claims of excuses of humanitarianism. Across Europe, governments were now facing sustained public pressure, and in Belgium itself, the situation had become an international embarrassment, not just for Leopold, but for the European powers that had sanctioned his rule, and it could no longer be ignored. Leopold had spent years presenting the Congo as his personal humanitarian project, but now, under mounting scrutiny, something had to give. And in 1908, it did. In 1908, under intense international and domestic pressure, and with growing public unease and reputation concern, the Belgian government intervened and took control of the Congo from Leopold. The Congo Free State, seized, was formally annexed by the Belgian state and renamed as the Belgian Congo. But this hijack and renaming was not justice to the Congolese. Leopold would never be tried for his atrocities against the Congolese, and there was no formal reckoning by the Belgian state or the European powers that had handed over the Congo to Leopold for what had taken place over the decades. In fact, the Belgian state, having taken over the Congo, did not fully dismantle Leopold's scheme of extraction and exploitation of the Congolese in the Congo. The system was largely transferred intact, with limited reforms introduced to curb the most visible abuses, reducing of overt violence and responding to international criticism, where the underlying system of extraction and control remained firmly in place. A year later, in 1909, King Leopold II died. He died having lost control of the Congo, but he never faced legal punishment for the system he had created or the suffering it had caused. His rule ended, but without accountability and without answer. Under Belgian control, the Congo entered a new phase. The Congo economy continued to revolve around extraction and forced labor in different forms, and political participation of the Congolese population remained severely limited. For decades, the Congo remained under Belgian colonial rule, shaped by the institutions and practices that had been established during Leopold's time until its independence in 1960. The new nation, now the Republic of the Congo, inherited a structure that had been built for extraction rather than governance. The inherited political institutions were fragile, experience in self-rule was limited, and the effects of decades of exploitation had left deep fractures within the society. The consequences did not end with independence. The loss of human life under Leopold's rule was staggering. Historians continue to debate the exact figures, but many suggest that the population of the Congo declined by several million people, with some placing the number at around 10 million. Though precise figures remain uncertain due to the absence of reliable records. The destruction of communities and the disruption of social and economic systems left scars that extended far beyond the colonial periods. Patterns of extraction to date remain embedded in the fabric of Congo's economy, and distrust towards authority, shaped by years of coercion and violence, still lingers within the population. What took place in the Congo also altered how the world would come to understand colonial rule. The exposure of Leopold's system became one of the earliest major international human rights scandals, forcing global attention onto the realities of imperial exploitation. But for the Congo itself, the legacy was not simply historical, it was lived. The story did not end in 1908, nor in 1960. It continued in the structures that remained, in the challenges that followed, and in the enduring effort of a nation to recover from a past that had reshaped it at its very core.